So the first story I want to tell you guys is about designer and developer communication. Designers say one thing, developers hear another. Developers say one thing, designers have no idea what they said. Or sometimes they talk back and forth for months on the same page, they know what's going on, and then they find out that they were talking about two completely different things. This isn't the designer's fault. This isn't the developer's fault. The fact is that designer and developer communication sucks. The next story is about designer collaboration. Now, every time you add another designer onto your team, you increase the chances of inconsistencies in your products. Designers understand design a little bit differently. They interpret things a little bit differently. And over time, they start to diverge. And this isn't the designer's fault. It's just that collaboration sucks. And the next story is multi-platform development. So every product has a different way of writing their code. And you end up with teams on different products who are basically creating their own unique ways of implementing the same exact thing. And now every time you have to make an update or a change to that thing, each one of these teams has to go back into their code bases and duplicate that same amount of work. Usually those changes never happen. This is not the problem of the fault of the developers. It's just that multi-platform development kind of sucks. When you put all of these things to a head, you end up with this really inefficient system and workflows. Communication sucks, collaboration sucks, multi-platform development sucks, and as organizations, the whole experience of building our products is kind of broken. And what you end up with is, if you're familiar with like Rube Goldberg, he has these illustrations of these super complex machines that either do nothing at all or they're just to do something incredibly mundane like spread butter on a piece of toast. Well, that's what we end up with. We have organizations where our system for building products is just the Rube Goldberg system of building products, and that really sucks. So I fell in love with these challenges about 5 years ago as an in-house designer working with external agencies and freelancers and trying to keep consistency across all the products and materials that we created. And then I moved on to a higher education tech company where I was able to build out a more fully fleshed out end-to-end multi-platform design system. Nowadays, I'm on Adobe's Spectrum team, and Spectrum is Adobe's design language and our design system. So the good news is, again, we've got some solutions to these problems, and that solution is a design system. Now, if we're looking at this problem as a broken experience in our organization, a design system is the glue that holds all those broken pieces together. It's the glue between design and development. It's the glue between research and our products. And in reality, what we're building is an internal product that services all of our externally facing products. Another way to look at a design system is that it encapsulates everything from design resources, tooling, and processes across design and development. This is things like branding, design assets, all the way over to content strategy and development standards. And in reality, there are a lot of nuanced definitions of what a design system is. But what's important is what a design system means to you and to your organization. So every organization is a bit different. You're going to have different problems and different solutions to those problems. So make sure you understand what it means to you and your organization when you're getting started with something like this. Another way for us to look at design systems is through the layers of a user interface. Now, looking at it this way allows us to think modularly and in the abstract. Typically, we've got the presentation layer of our UI, which is the way everything looks. We've got behavioral, the way it acts, and the functional layer is how everything works underneath. And I want to add a layer to this, and this is the principal layer. The principal layer represents all of the goals and the decisions that we use to make design decisions in our components and in our interfaces. So let me give you an example of what might exist there. Let's say your organization decides you want to use a formal type scale. You choose an augmented fourth, which means that all of your font sizes change at a ratio of 1 to 1.414. You also decided that you want a 16 pixel base font size. This is all you need to know. When you put this in the principles layer, you can then generate out all of the different font sizes that you consume in your components. All your headings, subheadings, body copy, those exist in the presentation layer. What's important, and the distinction that we're making here, is that in the principles, what we're defining are not hard values. What we're defining are relationships. So coming back to these layers, I've also made sure to distinguish between behavioral and functional. Now, the reason I've done this is usually the two of them are thought of as one and the same. Now, if you have behaviors built into the functional layer, the behavior of your components is going to be dependent upon the framework that it's built in. That's not very modular. You can't share those behaviors, and we end up with that same problem I was talking about earlier, where different teams are building the exact same thing. So if we separate the behavioral aspect of our interfaces in a way that can be shared down into the functional layers, we can keep those things consistent and in line. Now, one of the ways that we do this is all of those layers of the interface, from the principles, the presentation, and the behavioral, all those design decisions are basically just data. Now, if we create all of that data in a human-readable format like JSON or YAML, that's something that a designer can go and make changes to easily without learning how to code, and the developers don't have to, be basically task monkeys and going and make those changes on the behalf of the designers. They can go in and have some control there. The other benefit to this is if we define them as JSON or YAML, we can easily transform that data into any format that we need for all of our products to consume. So if all of your products use that design information as a dependency, every time you make updates and changes to that design, it'll propagate out to all of your different products. Another definition about design systems is that what you're really doing is designing relationships. What I mean by that is relationships between everything. The relationships between the elements of design, line, color, shape, space, typography. Relationships between those elements and your components. Relationships between the different components you have, and how those relate to bigger patterns and templates. How your products relate to one another. How development and design relate to one another. Developers, designers, and really the relationships between all of the people in your organization and how they relate back to the products that they help to design, build, market, and sell. Now, usually when we approach a design system, it starts off with the goal of getting consistency. And by consistency, it's usually product-wide consistency, right? So let's take a look at how we might do that. In order to get consistency, we have to have a shared set of resources that everybody's using. For all of those different shared resources to be successful, they have to come from a single source of truth. Now, for that single source of truth to actually be valuable is for that single source of truth to align 100% with the original design. The way that we can make sure that there's 100% alignment is usually with design artifacts that we create or the tooling that we have. And in order for those design artifacts and tooling to be successful, they need to adhere to and clearly communicate the foundational integrity of the original design's intent. And design intent is, again, the why behind every design decision that we make. So it seems that maybe consistency is not necessarily the goal. There are a lot of other things that have to happen in order for you to get consistency. So in reality, consistency is more of just a side effect of a properly implemented design system. So now I'm going to take a break. I'm going to hand things over to Alan Wilson. He's going to go through a little bit of the history of design systems at Adobe, listen to some of the problems he has and challenges that they've worked on over the years.
All right. Hi. Thanks, Nate. My slide won't have such awesome illustrations. But let me take a few minutes and introduce myself. I'm Alan Wilson. I've been a designer here at Adobe for about 6 years. And before that, I did a lot of print design. Right? I did a lot of brochures and package design and bottles and boxes. Every once in a while, a website. Another thing I did a lot of was branding. And whenever I was doing a branding project, we'd usually create one of these, a little brand guide, right? I didn't do this one. This is one for Coke. But it goes through, how to use colors and fonts, and make sure they space things, make sure they don't butcher their own logo, and things of that nature. And this will matter in a few minutes. But let me talk about how I started here at Adobe. So back in 2010, Adobe acquired a company called Omniture. Omniture did digital marketing and analytics, and that organization, or that part of Adobe, has grown to become what we now call the Experience Cloud. Anyway, after the acquisition, they were looking to make some improvements. They had all these products, and they weren't quite looking like each other, and they weren't looking like they wanted them. For instance, this is what we looked like in 2010. Good stuff. So we needed some help, and Adobe needed some help. So I was working for Eli Kirk, an agency down in Provo at the time, and we came in and tried to help. And there were a lot of issues here that we were confronted with. There's inconsistency within products, across products. We were new at this, so consistency was our goal here. And as we looked at the problem, we did what any good agency design org would do. We came forward with a fully baked solution, and we built out a design system. We had documentation, we had a complete content strategy with voice and tone, we had processes around everything with dev standards and a UI kit. We didn't know what we were doing. We had no clue that this is what we were about to embark on. So we did what we were familiar with, and we created a style guide, right? That little brand guide that I've been used to creating for people with their logos, I created an equivalent for a user interface. It was nothing more than a 60-page PDF that explained everything from spacing to fonts to colors, and it made it easier for developers and designers to have a source of truth. And it actually went over really well. Engineers loved this because they didn't have to bug designers anymore. Like, what's the color of that button you have? Where do I get that weird gradient asset so it gets the shiny effect on top? Because we were still doing that. And it was kind of confusing. And the design team actually really liked it as well. And long story short, I joined Adobe officially as a designer. And I want to tell the story of how this PDF, this 60-page booklet, became a mature design system over the last 6 years. So one of the first things that we wanted to address was icons. Our icons at the time looked like this. There were a lot more than this, but they looked something like this. And there were 3 problems that we saw right out the gate that we wanted to fix. One of them was simple style refinements. The style was a little dated, it was a little crude, and so we wanted to fix things up, just refine things, do what designers do, right? So that was pretty obvious. The next one was to clean up some of the metaphors. The metaphors had just sort of arisen out of need and organically, and no one had taken the time to really think through what we were communicating to our users. For instance, we were using an X for close, but an X with a circle meant delete. And we expected users to kind of follow that logic with us. And so we updated it to some more intuitive things like a garbage can for delete. And the last problem we want to solve was one of consolidation. We had all these assets floating around. We often had multiple icons for the exact same concept. And so we consolidated that, not only in their visual style, but so that they were all in one place and you knew where to go to find them. Years went by and our styles continued to evolve. We became a little more monotone in our style, and we began supporting both light and dark UIs. Now, at this point in time, we're still dealing with raster icons. These are all just PNGs that we're delivering. We have to deliver a different size depending on what's needed. And this is around 2012, 2013, And we're really running into problems with these high density displays, right? People with their Retina phones and Retina laptops around the corner, and we're not sure how to handle that. But we do a little research and we find that, SVGs are something we can do on the web now. And so we migrate to a vector-based asset system. And that goes really well. There's some style updates that go along with that. And things are going along well, but our icon library continues to grow. It gets bigger and bigger. And it starts to bring a real challenge for designers to find the icon they need, even if they know what it looks like. It's buried in this sea of other icons. There's also challenges in knowing which icon they should use for what situation. So we built a website. And the website addresses some of the things, talks about basic users guidelines and some frequently asked questions that we got. It delves into the process of requesting a new icon and adding it to the library. But most importantly, it had a complete library of our existing icons that could be searched, and you could find what you need in the size you need and configure it as needed. So that's what's going on the design side in this icon world over the past few years. Now, meanwhile, engineering hasn't been sitting back and just watching. They've gotten very involved. And about the time we had we migrated to SVGs, they created a system of tasks that would suck in all those SVGs, create a font, and then use that font as part of a system component. So all they have to do is call for an icon by name, specify a size and a color, and voila, the icon appears in the user interface. And more recently, we're probably going to be moving away from a font-based system. Has a lot of advantages, but also has some downsides. So we're probably going to be moving to SVG. But so as you can see, we continue to learn and evolve. So next, I want to talk about charts. In the Experience Cloud, we deal with a lot of data, and it's absolutely essential for our users to be able to understand all this data that's coming at them. And we've done a lot of research into this. This is, like I said, very important to us, and it's become one of my favorite subjects in design. And as much as I would love to go in and talk about all this, it would probably take about 3 hours to even do it justice. So I'm just going to skip it. We'll do that another time. And instead, I'll talk about developer tools. I alluded to a little bit with the icon font, but our developers were very involved. In fact, that initial PDF that was sent out, and all the engineers were really excited about it, and they were. There was one that came to me and said, "You know what, Alan, this is great. So happy to have this, but this looks a lot like code. Why is it floating around in a PDF?" And actually, we even had printed copies that were floating around the office. Why isn't this in code? And I said, I don't know, Larry, because I don't write code. That's probably why. He's like, well, I do. Let's work together. Let's see what we can figure out. And thus was born our first component library. We called it Adobe User Interface. And it was pretty simple. It was not sophisticated, but it captured all those basic variables so that other developers didn't have to rewrite them and they could consume them and use them in their products. Over the years, this evolved into a new system that we named Coral. You can think of Coral as a bootstrap-esque development framework. And it was really cool. It's got a lot of enterprise-level tools around localization and accessibility that you might not find in Bootstrap, but it's the same basic principle. And Coral was awesome, and it continued to grow. And in order to drive adoption and communicate out, which was a big piece of this, we had to build supporting resources. And one of that was a Coral website where users could go to find documentation. They could learn about it. They know how to install it and run all the tasks to get it running in their product. And they can also poke around the component library and see what components are and see what different states they have and different variants there are and what code they need to write to produce those. And it's pretty simple and a pretty effective tool. And the last thing that we did in Coral was we separated out the style layer. So initially, we had a single style, and it was just baked right into Coral. But as those styles evolved, we found the need to separate those two layers, and the importance of that became more and more clear over time. So let me talk a little bit more about the design language, that visual look and feel, right? Our initial design language was very basic. It was just that. What do our buttons look like? What do our different UI components look like? But over time, it grew more sophisticated to include behaviors and motion. It started to incorporate voice and tone and how we write copy. And initially, it was, like I said, in 2011, we had this green, and we slowly migrated and evolved the system over time. So I just took a couple components to give you a taste of what that looked like. And it was really fun for me to make this deck and look back over the years at just how bad some of our stuff was. But in 2013 and 14, what was driving our decision was this unknown beast of mobile. And we had to be a lot more touch-friendly, and we were worried about getting left behind, and so we put a lot of work and effort into doing that. We also left behind the PNG-style buttons, and we had to do all our buttons in CSS. But we were still supporting IE6 at the time, and so we had to make some compromises to deliver that, hence the lack of rounded corners. Eventually, development caught up with us, web standards caught up with us, and we were able to do so. Implement some styles that were a lot better. And some other important things happened around 2015. There were some organizational changes here at Adobe that made it for us, the group of designers here in the Experience Cloud, to work more closely with designers in Creative and Document Cloud. And as we started to put our heads together, we realized, well, we're all Adobe. We should have one design language, one design system. And thus was born a new design system that we call Spectrum. Now, you've probably seen Spectrum in Creative Cloud. Some of our creative apps rolled out a new UI last fall, and this is now being rolled out across Adobe. And so I want to talk a little bit about that. So here's a sample of one of our sticker sheets for Spectrum, right? This is the page that captures some of our basic text styles and buttons. And as you can see, it's just an Illustrator file. Like, we have an Illustrator and XD version of this. And as you scroll down, it's big. We've got lots of components. We've actually got dozens of these sheets to capture all the different nooks and crannies of what our design system covers. And initially, sticker sheets like this were all the team needed. For years, that was kind of the foundation of our design system, was these Illustrator files that floated around. And not floated around, I say that too loosely. We had a pretty good system for making sure everyone had the right version. But with Spectrum, we had additional resources and a lot more consumers as well. At this point in time, we're supporting over hundreds of designers and thousands of engineers that are building on this. And so we needed a website to help support this. So we have a Spectrum website now that gets into some of the stuff that can't be covered in that flat style sheet. You can't really speak to animation or workflows or how to localize things. What are the best practices around which button to use in which circumstance? And so this website covers a lot of that. So as you can imagine, as our design system has grown and matured over the years, we've had to tackle a lot of different things. For instance, accessibility, like readability and accessibility is a big deal. You guys messing with my mic? All right, I'll speak louder. I'm almost done. So accessibility, readability was a big deal. We had to get stakeholders to buy in. These things don't just magically occur. There is always organizational resistance to change. And some of these were pretty substantial changes. I'm just going to hold it. There's also the concept of storing all your design ideas in variables. So design tokens is a big topic that we could go into depth on how we've done that. communication strategies. How do people find out about this? How do they find out about when things change? How do they keep up to date? How do you communicate all this with engineering so that there's not that disconnect that Nate talked about between design and engineering? And then how do you ensure that everyone's using things as you want them to? And then user feedback is essential to any product, whether it's internal or external. How do you make sure that people are getting what they need in the way they expect to have it? So I don't have time to go on all that, and there's a million other things, but I'm going to pass the mic back over to Nate, and he's going to share some guidelines, some basic principles that are really useful, and I think kind of encapsulate the key takeaways that we've learned over the last few years.
All right, thanks, Alan. There we go. All right, so does that story that Alan told sound familiar to any of you guys? Going through some of that kind of stuff? UI overloads, trying to formalize everything. This is all very common. And every organization that has a mature design system has gone through or is still going through some of these growing pains. So hopefully what I want to do is try to alleviate some of those growing pains for you guys. After I log back into my phone. Sorry. So I've talked about the abstract of what a design system is and some of the problems that we have that we're trying to solve for. But how the heck do we go about building this? Well, you have to start by asking yourself, why the heck does my organization need a design system in the first place? Once you have a solid purpose in place, go ahead and list out some goals that you have for your system. These goals will help you with planning, creating milestones, but then also tracking your progress along the way. And there's a lot of great reasons for a design system, and some of the goals that you might have are things like creating a system that helps to facilitate rapid design and rapid development, creating a system that allows for scalable and evolving design, a system that is self-serviceable, or maybe a system that allows your designers and your developers to focus on the complex problems and focus less of their attention on the UI. Or maybe it's to create a system that allows you to create a suite of cross-platform solutions that are consistently branded. Now, once you have your goals in place, you're going to have to take these against your users. Now, find out who your target users are. If you're going to start small, that might just be your designers, maybe just the developers. Eventually, it's going to be both, and you have to start thinking about product management, sales, marketing, and so many more other people. But once you focus on the target user, go out, do your user research, find out what their needs are, and pit them against your goals. I hope this is sounding familiar. Basically, what you're doing is you're taking the same user-centric approach that you use to build your products right now, and you're flipping it introspectively. Now, one of the challenges with that is recognizing your own biases and overcoming them. But you can do it, and you should, to learn from your biases and gain empathy for all of the users in your organization who are going to be affected by your design system. Along with that's going to be identifying the primary pain points of your users. For engineers, maybe they just don't know what the heck you call your components. Is it a drop-down, a fly-out, a pop-over, a menu? I don't know. For your designers, maybe they can't agree on what to call a thing. No, it's a drop-down. No, it's a fly-out. No, it's a pop-over. Now, naming and taxonomy is going to be an issue and a pain point pretty much with every system. In the past, at the last design system that I worked on, what we did was we recognized this and we went out and we gathered a group of designers, front-end engineers, and back-end engineers who sometimes had to mess with the UI but were completely unfamiliar with it. And we had them go through a remote card sorting exercise to find out how they grouped components, how they named components, how they grouped them and named those groupings of components. And we used that data to inform how we should name and order and categorize our components so that it met the mental models of our users. This also helped to kind of settle some of the disputes internally with the design folks as to whether or not we should use atomic design taxonomies. Spoiler alert, that doesn't work. But once you know your users' pain points, now you're able to also find out what's the best way to solve for them. Another thing to consider is starting at the end. Understand how your users are going to consume their resources. For designers, is it something that they reference on a website? Is it something built into the tools? How are they going to consume these resources in a way that helps them achieve success? And then map this whole thing backwards, in reverse. Starting at the end will help you find out where to start. And you'll find out what needs to happen, where it needs to happen, how it needs to happen, and if you need to find or create new tools to help you get there. This same process works for the technological aspect of this too. How do your products consume things? How can you create a system for providing design information to them in a valuable way? Now, like every good product, you're going to have a product team. If your organization is small or you're just getting started, this can sometimes just be one person. One hybrid designer or developer could be all it takes to kind of get the ball rolling on a system. For most organizations, though, you may need one designer and one developer, and it really helps to have a product manager on board. This team is effectively going to have to be collective experts in your users, your products, the technology that your products use, and the resources and tools that your entire organization use. The team's also going to be responsible for creating an engagement model to engage with the rest of your organization, and they'll be responsible for fostering collaboration within your organization as well. Now, the most sure way for your design system to fail is to deliver it by force. Don't be a dictator. Now, governance is a necessary aspect of a design system. It helps you to monitor adoption, measure the implementation of your system, and it's also really great at course-correcting teams and offering that platform for collaboration. If they're not meeting their expectations, why is that? How can we help them to conform and meet their needs while still achieving ours? The other thing is that keep in mind, this system is for your users. Their success is your success. Another way to really empower your users is to gain a common understanding. So don't just name things because a senior designer said so, or because it's a trendy name. Go out and find out what to do, and test these things with your users. Another great thing to do is keep your system completely transparent. Let everyone have access to and understand what your plans are. Use those maps that you created of your users and of the technology. Use that as a map to communicate to them what your plans are and the scope of the product that you're building. And inevitably, this is going to come down also to documentation. Documentation is really, really important. This is something that you don't want to skimp on. Put a lot of time into writing good documentation. I'm not a writer, but I had to learn how to kind of at least wing it and understand, like, taking an active voice, being succinct yet informative, and adding just enough personality into your documentation that it's not sterile. Like, all of these things need to be thought about, and they also need to be brought back to your users. When you're writing documentation and coming up with these things, bring it back to your users. Don't even give them any guidance. Give them a piece of documentation and find out if they can figure out how to do what it says. If they can't, they won't be successful on their own. And again, if they're not successful, you're not successful. Now, inevitably, your design system's probably going to start with design. Design can either make or break your system. We're really just visually communicating with all of our users. We're using all of these different elements of design to say something. And it's our job to formalize those design decisions into a structured, logical way so that we can systemize it and so that we can codify it. Now, one of the ways that we can do this is with semantics. And semantics relate meaning to both language and logic. And this goes way beyond bootstrap semantics. You're saying a lot more to your users than simply red, yellow, green, and blue. Every border radius, beveled edges, shadows, gradients, line thicknesses, you're using each of these elements and combinations of these elements to say something. And if you can recognize those patterns and formalize them, that will not only help you to create a system for your language, but you can also help developers codify that system into your actual design system itself. The structures like semantics are structures that mirror development structures like mix-ins with Sass. You're just taking groups of attributes and applying them to multiple places, but this time the designers are doing it because there's meaning behind that grouping of elements. Now, I'm going to go into an example here. So let's say you've got a toolbar that looks like this. It's the early 2000s, beveled edges are cool. So you've got a beveled edge, a slight gradient, and some rounded corners. And you're looking at this, and you've got some other components across your interfaces that have the same type of style. Now, you recognize this pattern, and in looking at the components, you can see that they all have a similar interactive behavior. They all are, say, selectable. We can take that and use those three attributes and call them, a selected element style or a semantic of selected elements. And use that as part of our design and codify that into our system so that, say, 6 months down the road, we decide, okay, yeah, actually, we don't like that bevel, and we're going to get rid of it and the gradient and straighten out those corners. We can do that at a global level. We can simply change that selected element style or that semantic of selectability, and it changes in this toolbar and in every component that uses that as a method of communication, and it also propagates out into all the components in our products as well. Now, there's really two types of design that you're going to be engaged in with this process. There's designing the visual language, which is kind of what I just went over, and then there's designing the system. The system is a little bit more invisible. And in order to make your system scalable with an evolving design, it needs to be architected in a scalable way so that it scales with both technology and people. It needs to be created modularly so that it helps to reinforce that scalability, and you should automate as many processes as you can. You're also one of the users, and you need to have efficient workflows, so automate as much as you possibly can. And finally, don't repeat yourself. Find any opportunity to reduce, reuse, and recycle. With these four principles, you're going to be able to create a system that scales with the changing evolution of your design and of your technology. Something to keep in mind throughout this process is that the design will change, frameworks will change, technology will change, and people will change. So we have to design with that in mind. Now, looking again at this modularly, we've got our visual design language, our design system, and our frameworks. Now, usually these things get conflated. People easily conflate the design language with the design system, or the frameworks with the system, or sometimes all three of them as being one and the same. But they're really three separate and distinct elements, and they need to be treated as such in order to make sure that your system can scale and evolve. So let's go into another example, and I might get into the weeds with this one, but let's say you've got two different types of buttons. You've got a default button with a background and a border, and you've got a quiet button. The only difference really is that the quiet button doesn't have a background or a border. So as you're writing your design definitions, you list out what the background color is, the border, and the padding for the default button. The quiet button may have that same padding, but nothing else, so all you need to define there is the padding. Now, all of your teams integrate with your system. This is all hypothetical. Everything's perfect. Everything works fine. And it's implemented into your product and your design resources, and everything's great. Well, a little while later, you do some usability studies and you find out that, that quiet button is kind of invisible and our users are missing it. So we want to go ahead and add a little border to it. So you make this change. This change does not propagate out to any of your components. Every product team now has to go back in and account for this border attribute. That's because this system is built on the knowns. And one of the things you're going to have to account for when designing a system that scales is accounting for null values, accounting for the unknown. That way you can make these changes and additions to your components over time in a way that will not impact the technologies. Now, throughout this whole process, you should be getting feedback. Get feedback on your engagement model. Get feedback on the design itself. Feedback is really important. It's also a part of that user-centric process that allows you to understand what your users' needs are and how it's working for them. Feedback is also a great platform to offer to the rest of your organization as a way of them feeling like they're part of the system. And it's important that your organization and everybody else feels like they own this thing too. If they feel like they've got a say, and they do, and they're very smart, and their opinions are valid. So if they feel like they have a say and they have some control, they're going to be more likely to adopt it and support it. So be sure to keep that open connection. And the last thing you're going to have to do, and this is probably never going to stop, but you're always going to have to get buy-in. Quantifying a design system is a very difficult thing to do. I'm not sure I know the best way to do it. The way that I've done it in the past is thinking about it in terms of operational efficiency. You can take a look at how much time it takes for developers to build components that may exist elsewhere, or designers to rebuild elements that you've already got designs for. Take that, multiply it by the number of developers or designers that you have over the span of a year, translate that into dollar values, and you've got a pretty loud voice in that regard. For the last system that I built, what we ended up finding out, though, is after we started implementing our design system, our biggest advocates was the sales team. So we had already had designers using our design resources. Products were following a migration plan to adopt the design system, so they started to look more consistent. And our sales team noticed that affect their sales demos. Customers were seeing consistency through all of our products. So it made the process of our salesmen going through cross-product demonstrations that much easier. It made selling our product easier. And they took it upon themselves to not only reach out to us, but to executives and let them know just what an impact this was having on their jobs. That helped us get top-level buy-in that really helped us to ensure that we could sustain the system for a while longer. So if you're just getting started with this process, make sure that you understand what your goals are. What's the reason behind doing all of this? What do you aim to accomplish? Know who your users are, and make sure that your goals align with their goals. Identify the gaps in your system. How do you make sure that you are providing something that's valuable to the users, and how do you make sure that that happens? Make sure to create a collaborative team. Engage with your users. Keep an open discussion with them and let them be involved. Design a visual language, not just an interface, not just a sticker sheet. Structured, logical, linguistic, visual design. Keep it modular. As your design changes, as your frameworks change, as technologies change, your system should still retain its integrity. Then keep getting feedback constantly and take that feedback seriously. And finally, don't ever stop selling your system. Thank you, guys.